order to be able to really answer this question, you've got to be honest. You don't have to be honest with me. You don't have to be honest with the person next to you, but you at least have to be honest with yourself. And hopefully, if you've been here, if you've been listening over the last few weeks, you've really started to think about this question. Perhaps you even find yourself answering it a little bit differently today than maybe you would have a couple weeks ago. We started out talking about Joseph, and we saw the pain and the hurt and the rejection that he went through and how he stayed true to following God even through all of that. And even though, Joseph's story ends up being one of a lot of success, he ends up saving the lives of his people. God used all of the bad stuff that happened in his life to perform an incredible good. But the outcome was never the reason he followed. He followed because following God is the win. And last week we looked at Ruth, and John kind of already talked about this a little bit, and the remarkable decision that she made to follow. You have this non-Jewish woman whose Jewish husband has just died, and it's just Ruth, and it's her sister-in-law and her mother-in-law, Naomi. And Naomi plans to return back to her homeland, and she tells her daughters-in-law that they should do the same. They should return to their home, to their people. And Ruth's sister-in-law does just that. But Ruth decides that she wants to go with Naomi because she wants to follow the one true God. And they return with nothing, right? I mean, they walk harvested fields just to be able to pick up enough scraps to eat for the day. She catches the eye of Boaz, and they get married, and then she ends up being a mother in the genealogical line of Jesus, who would one day come and sacrifice himself to redeem the world. But she didn't know that any of that was going to happen. She just knew that following God was right. See, getting married was not the goal. If that was the goal, she most likely would have returned to Moab. Having possessions and property to call her own was not the goal. If that was the goal, she would have returned to her family and to the life that she had known before ever meeting Naomi's family. The outcome wasn't the reason that she followed. Following God was the win. And this idea of doing what you ought to do, even if it could end up costing you, is essentially what integrity is. If you remember, I talked a couple of weeks ago about choosing to be people of remarkably high integrity. Well, this is essentially what that is, doing what you ought to even when it costs you. But see, the interesting thing about having low integrity is it usually costs someone else. It may eventually come back to bite you, but it will almost always cost someone else. So you lie to kind of save your bacon, and someone else gets in trouble for what you did. You blame the team at work for a mistake that you made, and then everybody gets reprimanded. And they have no idea why they're being yelled at, but you feel relieved because you didn't have to take all the heat yourself. Or you make fun of someone, or you treat them poorly because they're different from you, or they believe differently than you do. And you feel better about you. You feel justified. You feel vindicated. But they're left feeling beat up and hurt. And for some people, that may sound just fine. At least I feel good. At least I got my way. At least I got my point across. They really needed to hear what I had to say anyway. But that should not be a defining characteristic of a Jesus follower. So today, we're going to look at a story that is probably familiar to many of you. And as soon as you hear who the story today is about, you'll be tempted to fast forward almost to the end of his story where this really amazing, awesome, incredible miracle happens. It's a very cool and very amazing miracle, something that we know and we talk about. You've probably heard about it before. But I think when we do that, when we fast forward to that part in the story, we kind of miss a big part of what is really happening here. And when we do that, I worry that we even end up possibly drawing the wrong conclusion from the story. And I don't want us to do that. So stick with me. Here we go. The character that we're going to talk about today is Daniel. And Daniel is a young man from Israel, and the story begins with teenage Daniel and his friends being taken away into captivity in Babylon. Now, Babylon is a very wealthy city in the ancient world. So while this is certainly not a preferable situation, this is the ideal place to get taken if you were going to get taken somewhere by force, which nobody wants. But the main reason for that is because they would be taken to work in the king's palace, which would mean that food would be provided for them so that they would be healthy enough in order to continue to work. And this is a huge deal because back then, all around the world, food was incredibly scarce. And Daniel and his buddies would have access to something that a lot of other people would not have. Now, just to be clear, Daniel and his friends were still slaves to a people that were notorious for treating people horribly. So this was definitely not a good situation by any means whatsoever, but at least they would have food to eat. But there's one issue with this perk that Daniel and his friends would have access to. And right at the beginning of the story, we see what the problem is. See, Daniel and his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, now you may not know them by those names because their names were changed by the Babylonians because their Hebrew names were reflective of God. They were designed to make them think of God. Daniel, meaning God is my judge. Hananiah, meaning the grace of the Lord. Mishael, meaning he that is the strong God. And Azariah, meaning the Lord is a help. See, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, wanted them to forget about God. So he gave them new names. You may be more familiar with their new names: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Shadrach, meaning inspiration of the sun, which was a god that they worshipped. Meshach, meaning of the goddess Shak, also known as Venus in other cultures. And Abednego, the servant of the shining fire, which is also something that they worshipped. Now, this is kind of a side note, but something I find interesting about this story is that Daniel was also given a new name. Daniel's Babylonian name was Belteshazzar. And basically nobody remembers that. Right? Nobody remembers that, but we remember Daniel's Hebrew name, but we remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the Babylonian names of his friends that were there with him. Now, that's probably not an important part of the story, but I just find that interesting. I don't know about you. So anyway, Daniel and his friends, we will refer to them as Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They get together and they make a decision. Now, here's the decision that they made. Essentially, Daniel kind of made it for everybody, but they all collectively agreed, this is what we're going to do. In Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, it says, "But Daniel resolved." Now, resolved is a strong and definitive translation for the words that are used here, but in the Hebrew, the words that are used mean that he set his heart, meaning that he set his heart solid in a place that for him could not be compromised, right? So Daniel set his heart. Verse 8 again. "But Daniel resolved," or set his heart, "not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way." I mean, think about this. Daniel, barely a teenager, probably 12, 13, 14 years old, something like that. And he knew that something about eating this food would desecrate him or defile him. Now, why did he think that? The main reason is because in the ancient world, the provision of food and the wealth and prosperity that would come from that it gave to you was tightly connected to God or to the gods, depending on your belief system. See, the Babylonians made this connection just as much as Israel did, only they didn't connect it to the Hebrew God. They connected it to their man-made God. And Daniel knew that if he ate this food that was often foods his people were not supposed to consume, foods that were often part of the Babylonian sacrificial system, being sacrificed to their gods, Daniel knew that if he ate that food and it gave him health and he prospered in what he did and he did good work, as a result that Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians would attribute his success, they would give credit to Marduk, the Babylonian god. And Babylon had just come in and they had destroyed the temple, and they had conquered Jerusalem, carted away all of their goods. I'm sure Daniel was not real excited about giving their God credit for his life. So Daniel, teenage Daniel, says, look, I'm not going to let them give credit to Marduk that belongs to God, so I just won't eat the food. I mean, imagine making a decision like that. It says that he made up his mind. It's clear that he did so ahead of time, before knowing how the story of Daniel would turn out. So again, we know how it turns out. He had no idea. And the reason that any of us know the story of this guy named Daniel is because he made up his mind, because he set his heart. Daniel knew something that I think that many of us know as well, but we often forget in the times that we need to remember it the most. Daniel knew that one breach of integrity leads to another. I mean, doesn't it though? One breach of integrity has a tendency to lead to another one because the first breach makes the second one easier. Once you've been willing to breach your integrity once, doing it again, it gets a lot easier to do. And the second breach creates a pattern, right? And a pattern is a direction. Once you develop a pattern in your life, you have set yourself into a particular direction. And direction, not intention, determines your destination. I mean, you can have all the best intentions in the world of always doing the right thing, but if that's not the direction that you're actually going, then your destination will not be a person of remarkable high integrity. For example, there's a road near where I live that floods very frequently, okay? And when that happens, it blocks my route to work. But fortunately, there is another route that I can take that takes pretty much the exact same amount of time. It doesn't really take any additional time at all. I just have a habit of going the other way. It's just what I do, right? Now, on several occasions, more times than I would like to admit, I have known when I went to bed that that road was either already flooded or was very likely to be flooded in the morning. And so I would intend to go the other direction in the morning. But as the song goes, then the morning comes, and I go, my habit that I have formed, it takes over, and I go the way that I usually go. And I end up staring at one of these. Who doesn't love that, right? I mean, I sit there in front of this thing for just a second, and I'm like, ugh, I knew that I wasn't supposed to go this way today. Anybody ever been there before? Am I? Okay, I'm not the only one who's done that. But see, here's the thing, right? My intention to go the other way didn't mean much at this point. Not when you're staring face to face with a road closed sign. Because the direction that you're going determines where you end up. Now, that may sound overly simplified, but it's very true. So Daniel and his friends, they made up their minds ahead of time, and that decision resulted in them feeling compelled to decline the food served by the king. That decision was immediately met with some possible consequences. Daniel chapter 1, verse 10, it says, "But the official told Daniel, 'I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you.'" See, doing the right thing was going to cost Daniel, or possibly cost someone else, or maybe both of them. But what do you do when you're certain doing the right thing will cost you? Well, it depends what's most important to you. For Daniel, his integrity before God was more important than the king, was more important than the official over him. It was even more important than a free meal plan. But Daniel cared, right? Daniel didn't want the officer to lose his head, literally. So he says to him, "Why don't you test us first?" Daniel 1, verse 11, it says, "Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, 'Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see.' So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. Now, what you are about to hear is not an endorsement for vegan or vegetarian diets, all right? I just want to make sure that I say that, okay? Daniel chapter 1, verse 15, it says, "At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food." Now, I said what I said about this not being an ad for becoming a vegetarian, partially because it's sort of funny, but also because I have actually heard this used as a proof text for vegan or vegetarian diets. That is not the point of this story, all right? See, God blessed Daniel and his friends because of the choice that they had made to stay true to the Spirit's leading, not to defile themselves in this way. If eating nothing but vegetables had left them weak and unable to do their jobs and had ended up with them being killed by the king or just died because they lacked nourishment that they needed, they decided ahead of time that it was worth it, that they were willing to take that chance. We don't know if they had any idea what making such a sacrifice would mean to them physically. We just knew that they were willing to make that sacrifice. Now, instead, God blessed their commitment to do what was right and according with his commands for the Jewish people, and that's what happened. Now, as a result of this, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they pass the test, and they end up in the king's service. So now, at this point, we're going to fast forward just a hair in Daniel's story. Just a little bit, to 55 years later. Now, I know that we're moving kind of quickly here, but 55 years later, Daniel is still working for the king, not the same king, because the Babylonian Empire has come and gone. The Persian Empire has taken over. And now Daniel works for a man who, get this, entitles himself the King of Kings. That's what the Persian Emperor Darius calls himself. So Daniel is about 70 years old. And Darius decides that he wants to reorganize the empire into the first galactic... No, wait, never mind. That's the wrong empire. Okay, somebody caught that. All right. No, Darius decides that he wants to reorganize the Persian Empire, so he appoints 120 governors that will report to 3 administrators. And Daniel has been around forever at this point. I mean, he's been there longer than Darius has. And Darius makes him one of the 3 administrators. And this is where, in my view, the story really starts to pick up. In Daniel chapter 6, verse 3, it says this: "Now Daniel so distinguished himself amongst the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs." Now, I mean, that should be pretty simple, right? I mean, he's been there for 55 years. Put this in the context of any person around politics that you know of, right? I mean, no doubt that in 55 years of personal history in government work, being around political leaders, they should have no problem being able to dig up some dirt on Daniel, right? Well, verse 4 continues, and it says, "But they were unable to do so." I mean, wow. Can you imagine what Daniel had to give up in order to have this said of him? I mean, imagine the opportunities that he had to have let pass by, right? The things that he could have done, that a person in his position probably could have gotten away with, that maybe other people just wouldn't be allowed to do. But he chose not to. Rights, liberties, freedoms that he could have claimed, but didn't. I mean, you think that he gets to this point in his life, about 70 years old, and he thinks, you know what? I really missed out on a lot of stuff that I could have done, and all I have to show for it is this good reputation. Wow, I am lame. Jeez, I'm just a really boring person. You think that he thought that? I don't think that he did. Again, now, verse 4 continues on. "But they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent." I mean, and this might be the single best thing that could ever be said of a person. I mean, wouldn't you love it after a long, well-lived life that this could be said of you? But what would you be willing to give up so that something like this could be said of you? And would it be worth it to you to do that? To give up whatever that is in order to have a statement like this be able to be said of you? But see, Daniel was this kind of person at 70 because he was this kind of person at 17. And now maybe you're sitting here today or you're listening and you're older than 17. That's okay. Make that decision today. Start today. It is not too late. Anyway, these men, so the other governors, they realize now that they need a new plan, right? Their old plan isn't going to work. They're going to have to come up with something different. Verse 5, it says, finally these men, they said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with his law, with the law of his God. I mean, wouldn't it be great if the only accusation a person could make against you had something to do with your incredible commitment to God? Wouldn't it be great if the only thing people could find to criticize Christians for was that we believe this crazy idea that a guy died and then rose from the dead. But other than that, they're just really the best people. They're so kind. They're so reliable. They always keep their promises. They're so honest. They have great relationships with each other. They're weird about that whole Jesus resurrection thing. But other than that, I hope that, my neighbor is a Christian. I hope that my daughter marries one. I hope that my son marries one. I hope that, I work for one. I want to hire them maybe if I'm an employer. Yeah, I actually like being around them. Heaven forbid they might say, I even wish that there were more of them. Wouldn't that be great if that's what people thought when they thought of Christians? So back to Daniel's story. They couldn't find anything against him, so they set a trap for him. In verse 7, it says, the royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed. They're talking to Darius right now. We've all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except you, your majesty, shall be thrown into a lion's den. So they butter him up, right? They're like, oh, Darius, you're just so amazing. You're so awesome. You deserve 30 days of Darius where all we do is think about you and worship you and talk about how awesome you are. So, he's like, yeah, we should do that. I agree. So he issues a decree. He puts it in writing, so it's official. So what do you think that Daniel should do at this point? We know he's most likely, he's not going to bow down and worship Darius, right? That's not going to happen. So maybe he should just hold off on worshiping and praying to God. 30 days. It's just 30 days. No big deal. He could do that. Not a problem, right? That seems like a good idea. But what do you do when you're certain doing the right thing will cost you? Well, it depends what's most important to you. And the answer to this question, not the question, what do you do when you're certain doing the right thing will benefit you, but what do you do when you're certain doing the right thing will cost you? The answer to this question is where we determine if our integrity is disposable. In chapter 6, verse 10, it says, now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. He left the windows open because that's what he always did. He faced that direction on purpose because that's what he always would do. His integrity was not disposable. His integrity was not just simply a means to an end. Well, I rose to this high position in the kingdom. Me being a good guy must have worked out pretty well for me. That's not what it was about. What type of faith do the people around us see? But again, he also didn't change in order to be seen. He just did what he had always done before. And if he had not done it, this story might not be in the Bible. There probably wouldn't be much of a story to tell. And I'm glad that he did it. And if I'm being honest with you, I wish that I was more like that. I really do. See, Daniel had settled something in his mind, something that he no doubt had learned and seen play out over and over again. And that is that God determines outcomes. See, Nebuchadnezzar thought that he determined outcomes. But if you read the story and find out what happened, and you should check out the book of Daniel and read that story, you'll see he didn't determine outcomes. Daniel knew that that wasn't the case. He knew that God determines outcomes. Darius didn't determine outcomes any more than Nebuchadnezzar or anybody else. So, the governors, they spot Daniel praying to God still, and this is what happens. Chapter 6, verse 12, it says, "So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except you, your majesty, would be thrown into a lion's den?" I seem to remember you did that. Did you do that? The king answered, "The decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." Then they said to the king, "Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah, he pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree that you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day." And the interesting thing about this is that Darius was incredibly distressed by this news because he liked Daniel. Daniel was one of his most trusted men, but now he was stuck by his own decree. So in verse 16 it says, "So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and they threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, 'May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you.'" See, Darius noticed something that he, a person who does not believe what Daniel believes, he says, "I hope that the God that you are more committed to than you are committed to yourself will rescue you." And they put him into a lion's den. They lower a stone down over them. But look at how this king, again, a king who does not believe what Daniel believes. He has no relationship with the one true God. Look at how he acts. Chapter 6, verse 19. This is Darius' response. "At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the lion's den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, 'Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you?'" I mean, wow. And unlike every time I've ever been told this story, we're not going to rush straight to the end. See, the heavy-hitting punch of Daniel's story is not what happens next. It's what's already happened. If Daniel's primary concern was the outcome of this story, he would not have done what he did. Daniel's primary concern was doing the right thing. Daniel had already won. Doing the right thing was the win. And he had already decided, right? He wasn't willing to not eat the food and end up in a lion's den. And he wasn't willing to continue to pray to God and not pray to Darius and end up in a lion's den as long as God would, take him out and keep him alive and bring him through that situation. He was willing to go to the lion's den even if it meant him dying there. There are no guaranteed outcomes in this life, and that's okay because we serve and we follow the one who controls outcomes. Now, I don't want us to miss this. I don't want to sidestep or diminish the absolutely incredible and amazing miracle that happens here, right? We're not going to skip that because God performs an amazing miracle that is absolutely deserving of its own time and attention. See, this part of Daniel's story ends with the lions' mouths being shut and Daniel being delivered from the lion's den. But that isn't simply the point of Daniel's story. I mean, what if Daniel had died in that den of lions? Would it have been worth it if that was the way it ended? The decision that he makes tells us that he definitely thought that it was. He knew that it was. So what about us? What do we do when we're certain doing the right thing will cost us? What do you do? I mean, what if you never get noticed? What if the world overcomes you and you get swallowed up? What if you go through seasons where it feels like all of the outcomes are against you despite doing the right thing? Is it worth it? I want to tell you that it is. I know that it is. But only you can decide if it's worth it for you. So make a decision like that today. Making that decision will make your life better, and it will make you better at life. Not because everything will work out the way that you want it to, but because you won't have to worry about managing outcomes. You're not in control of most of them anyway, and I'm not either. See, we get to decide to follow Jesus, but we don't get to decide what following looks like. And Jesus already defined the win for us. Following is the win. Now, next week, we're going to take a look at the invitation that Jesus makes to anyone and to everyone. And we're going to look at some of the first people to accept that invitation. And I'm really excited for that. I hope that you guys will come back and join us next week to hear that story. But as the band